I told you a little bit of our story. We had the privilege of crashing together with Building God's Way about 6 years ago. It was kind of a natural fit for us because when there is a Christian architectural and building firm that just so happens to be in Ogden, Utah, where we're at, like those are guys that we want to know, that we want to talk to and be a part of. And we have fallen in love with the heart and the ministry of Building God's Way. And that started by going through our very own process. 5 years ago, we had been a church for about 6 years at that time that had bounced around from one rented facility to another. And we found ourselves at a place where in the rental market, we just couldn't keep up with our growth. We were always falling behind. In every building that we rented, all the way up until the last one, we had taken an old 20,000 square foot Gold's Gym facility that had just closed down, which had always smelled like a Gold's Gym all the way until the day that we left. And we dumped tens of thousands of dollars to turn this old gym into a church. And guess what happened? Our landlord realized that he now had a more valuable piece of property, and our rent kept going up every year when it came time to renew the lease because the landlord kept daring us to walk away from the ever-mounting investment that we were making in his building. That's what you call a lose-lose initiative, right? And so we began to dream, what does it look like for a church like us to move into a new space? And at that point in time, our church had grown to about 1,000 people, which sounds really, really, really exciting. But these are 1,000 people that had never been in church before in their life. Which, let me tell you, there's some awesome things about being a pastor of people who've never been a part of another church. They don't know how wrong we do everything inside of our church. They have no frame of reference. So they think our dysfunction is normal, which is really awesome, right? But let me tell you a few other problems about reaching unchurched people. I have yet to meet a first-time visitor walking through the doors of our church and saying, hey, how do I get on board with this tithing thing? How does that happen? Like, I'm just waiting to give my money to somebody. Where do I do that? We were a church that was effective in reaching our community, but we were struggling financially. We were struggling with longevity and a future. God had done a lot in the first 5 or 6 years of our ministry, but I'm going to be honest with you, there were a lot of days, still as a tent-making, bivocational pastor, pastoring 1,000 new believers inside of our community. I thought, God, is this sustainable? Is there going to be anything left when I come to the end of myself? Which felt like it was coming really quick. How many of you have ever been there in ministry? And so we began to look around our community, and what we realized is it was going to take a miraculous move of God. And we found this dilapidated, old 1940s brick Coca-Cola bottling factory that had been shuttered and closed down for 30 years. And when we saw that building, we thought, that is just the kind of space for us. Because those are the kind of people that God has called us to reach. You see, we're a drug full of former people, former addicts, former strippers and dancers, former abusers, former felons. How many of you know that's the story of the gospel, right? And we thought, man, what a great thing that we could move into a former building that has been a blight on this community. The city government had actually tried to raise the money to tear down this building, and when they got into it, they realized it was going to cost them more money to get rid of the building than just to leave it sitting there empty. And so needless to say, we got kind of a good deal on the property. And we engaged with Building God's Way to turn that into a ministry center. And so you can see pictures of that old Coca-Cola bottling factory floor. And man, God has just been good to us. And I say this all the time, but it is so true. If there were 100 rules to how to plant a church effectively, I promise you guys we broke 99 of those rules. When we moved to Utah almost 12 years ago, now, there was nobody there to tell us we should have had a launch team. Like, I look at church planters today and I'm like, gosh, I wish I had a mentor and a coach. I wish I had somebody to tell me what to do. Like, I wish we had known about preview services and building a core team. And like, we didn't know how to do anything. We showed up in a city and the only thing we knew how to do is to love people because Jesus loved us when we didn't deserve it. And can I tell you that even though we did 99% wrong, it was the one thing we got right, which was the gospel of Jesus Christ that has fueled a movement that is now going into the darkest places of our world. And so today, we have been able to plant 5 other Genesis Project campuses. We have one in Provo, Utah, which is the home of Brigham Young University, which is not a Bible college, by the way. I don't know if you knew that. Provo is in Utah County. That's a very clever name, isn't it, to be in Utah? Utah County represents the largest religious majority in the United States of America, close to 97% Latter-day Saint or Mormon in that town. There's never been a Christian church that has grown and found sustained health. Most churches had about a 5-year window of life before they shut down in that community. And we felt like that's where God was calling us to go. Today, we have the largest Christian church in all of Provo, Utah, with about 250 people that are a part of the Genesis Project there. And it is one of the big faith and miraculous stories that we have seen God do. We've also had the privilege of planting a Genesis Project in New Orleans, Louisiana, which how many of you know that's like another country, man? Like, you go to Louisiana, those people are crazy. They eat roadkill for dinner, and that's a whole nother story I can tell with you. Like, every time I go down there, I'm like, man, I grew up in the dirty South, you guys. I grew up in Atlanta, and I go to Louisiana, it's like, y'all know dirty South. Like, you got this thing. And they're proud of it. But man, we sent a team, when we were just a church of a couple hundred people, we sent a team of over 30 down to do hurricane relief just after Katrina. And 20 of those 30 people represented 10% of our church and over 30% of the giving of our local church in Ogden. Said, Pastor, we feel like God is calling us to go and stay and establish a church in New Orleans. I told them no. You're not, no, I didn't. I didn't say that. I said, yeah, let's do it, man. Let's just go. And God has established an incredible church in the middle of a very unchurched city, in what would be considered a very dark place in our world. And God is doing incredible things there. We have another campus that most recently we planted in Portland, Oregon. And Portland is widely considered one of the most unchurched, irreligious places in our nation. And right in downtown Portland, Oregon, we have a growing movement that is choosing to love people like Jesus with no strings attached right where they're at. And the big story in the book that we gave you today really centers around our campus in Fort Collins, Colorado. And about 5 years ago, we had the privilege as a church of purchasing the only functioning strip club in Colorado north of Denver. The strip club was called the Hunt Club. And for 30 years, many people in the town of Fort Collins, Colorado would have told you point blank that it was the darkest place in their community. Over 30 years, there was a murder in that parking lot 3 different times. It was a hub of sex trade and prostitution. It was a place where young girls that had gone off to college at Colorado State University in Fort Collins lost their way, lost their hopes, and lost their dreams. But completely unrelated to us, about 10 years ago, that strip club, the owner who had founded it and started it passed away. And he gave it as an inheritance to his 3 sons. One of those sons, named Aaron, became the general manager of that strip club. It's all he ever knew. He actually started working there when he was 13 years old. And he never really thought twice about the business that he had grown up inside of until one day his 5-year-old daughter came home from her kindergarten classroom and she said, Daddy, all the other dads are coming into our class next week to tell everybody what they do when they go to work. Out of the mouth of babes, right? For the first time in Aaron's life, he was in his 30s. He experienced conviction through the innocence in the heart of a little girl that got her placed in his family and his home. So he began to go on a journey looking for what was broken inside of him. A church, again, completely separate from what God was doing at the Genesis Project, happened to hang a flyer for a men's ministry event on Aaron's door. And, you know, the world may tell us that mailers aren't very effective, and they're not. You don't get a whole lot of bang for your buck in this world anymore. But let me tell you that this flyer changed the life of a man, because he went to a men's conference and radically gave his life to Jesus. But then he had to figure out the mess. And how many of you would agree that's the way it happened for all of us? We didn't figure out our mess and then come to Jesus. We came to Jesus and then realized, like, whoa, I'm a mess. So now he had his livelihood, a 6-figure income, this club that he had to figure out, man, what am I going to do with this? And so Aaron began to go on a journey knowing that God was asking him to do something different than just selling the club to another proprietor that would keep doing the same things over and over again. So he had this dream. What if I could find a church that was willing to buy out my 2 brothers that own 66% of this club, and I'll donate my 1/3, and we can turn this place into a community center, a church, and an outreach center for Fort Collins. So he went and started knocking on church doors. Never been to a church before, tattooed from head to toe. He looked every bit like the person that he used to be. And how many of you know he heard no a lot? A lot of churches said, we're not in the business of buying strip clubs. We don't think that's good for us. But he ran into one church in Fort Collins that happened to be one of our sending churches when we moved to Utah that said, we don't know if we can buy that strip club, but we know a group of guys that might just be dumb enough to do it. They're called the Genesis Project. And through that journey, the pastor of a large mega church ministry, over 10,000 members, who was actually the man who led me to Jesus, his name was Rob Coles. We toured that strip club for the very first time. We had to actually tour it at about 6 o'clock in the morning because it was still a functioning business at the time. And both of us broke down and started weeping when the smell of cheap perfume still filled the air in a locker room where there were pictures of moms with their babies and their children. But hanging on a sign above the door was the most vile, vulgar, derogatory sign meant to keep these women in their place. Walking out of the strip club that first day, I was overwhelmed. I didn't know how we were going to do it. It was going to cost about $2 million to purchase this property and to remodel it. I'm telling you guys, it was one of the most filthy places, just physically filthy, that I'd ever seen in my life. Like, no one had turned the lights on in this place in a long, long, long time. And the filth was just a picture of what was so broken about the hurting lives represented inside of that place. And as we walked into the parking lot that day, my mentor and my friend Rob, who had just at the time turned 50 years old. And how many of you know sometimes when we feel like we're on the back end of ministry, that's just when God is like, no, like I do really well with 80-year-olds. Just ask Moses. I do really old with second wind. Just ask Abraham, right? And Rob in the parking lot that day had the job that most guys aspire to get to in ministry. And we sat in a little car in the freezing cold of northern Colorado that day with tears streaming down his face. He said, Matt, I have to lead this, whatever this is. So he resigned the position of a mega church in order to take a strip club and see what God had in store. And so through the leadership of Rob and his wife Joy, we decided to set out to do the impossible for a poor, underdeveloped 5-year-old church. We're going to say, God, if we can raise the $2 million, we're going to put it in your hand. And God put us in the right rooms. He allowed us to have conversation with people that we didn't deserve to be sitting at a table with. How many of you know God will do that? It's called favor when you're doing what he asked you to do. And we decided, God, if you can raise $2 million, then we believe that you can allow us to raise $2.5 million. And we're going to set aside $500,000, more money than we've ever held in our hand before in our life, as a no-strings-attached fund for every bouncer, bartender, and dancer inside of this club that's going to lose their job because of what you're doing in this space. God allowed us to raise that entire budget in about 3 months. It was supernatural. I keep trying to do that and replicate that over and over again. It hasn't worked again. So, on the day that we signed the papers of the club, we sat in a room like this with every person that was going to be losing their job that day. No one had prepared them for what was coming, and they were hearing from a pastor that your place of employment is going to become a church, and you can imagine it wasn't a friendly crowd. It wasn't people like, oh, thank you so much, we're so appreciative. One girl stood up, her name was Betsy. She'd been dancing at that club for close to 20 years. She started dancing there with a fake ID when she was 16 years old. She put her finger in our face. And she said, I've got an 8th grade education and 3 boys at home. I've never done anything else with my life. What the, and you can fill in the blanks, is your money going to do to replace my $180,000 a year income that I'm making in this place? You ever get to the point where you don't have answers to the questions that are being asked of you, right? So, you said, what we have is yours. What can we do to serve you, Betsy? And she said, I'm going to have to drive to Denver now. It's almost an hour and a half away, and I don't have reliable transportation. That's the closest club where I can go and dance. And I don't have anybody to watch my kids at night when I go there, because it's going to be extra time back and forth. And we said, awesome, we'll buy you a car. I mean, sometimes Jesus can work through buying a car, reliable transportation for a woman to continue to live the life that he would never hope for her to live, just to get his point across that he loves her. 2 weeks into her commuting to this new club in Denver, every night dropping her 3 boys off at the home of Rob and Joy, our campus pastors there in Fort Collins. She calls Joy. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. I don't know what the, again, fill in the blanks, right? You people have done to me. But I have been doing this for 20 years, and tonight I was in the middle of a lap dance, and I broke down weeping and crying uncontrollably. It's never happened to me before. You people have effed me up. And she didn't say effed. She said, I'm coming home to get my kids. A year later, and sometimes it takes a year, right? Betsy gave her life to Jesus, was baptized in a horse trough in the very same building that she used to take her clothes off in for a living. It's the power of being embedded. And what's cool is if you were to lay out a family tree of how our campus has grown from nothing to now over 600 people in this little, small, cramped building in Fort Collins, Colorado, the truth is that Betsy has drugged more people to church than the pastoral staff in whole. That she has become one of the most effective evangelists that her community has ever known. Why? Because she is dead center in the middle of what it means to be a church that is bravely running in the direction of Jesus. And that's the conversation that we want to have today with you. Because if you leave this seminar today and say, man, we're going to go buy a strip club in Cleveland, don't do it. It's not a good idea. But if we can leave you here today inspired with this simple question: what does it mean for you, your church, your congregation, to run bravely in the direction of Jesus? Remember when Saul and John, I'm a preacher, so sometimes I just got to preach, you guys. Remember when King Saul and Jonathan were going into battle, and Saul just came to a point where he said, man, I'm sick and tired of fighting these Philistines. I don't want to fight anymore. And so he hid out in a pomegranate grove. Remember that story in the Bible? He said, we're not going to fight today. And Jonathan, the son of the king, became incensed. And he says, there's an enemy out there. And so he gathered together his armor bearer, which was probably just a young teenage boy. And he said, get my armor, get my sword, and today we're going to go out and fight the Philistines, and perhaps, listen to these words, perhaps God will move in our favor. That's bravely moving in the direction of God's calling. And that day Jonathan went out, and alone he took on an army. And what happened? It inspired the army that was hanging out and eating in the pomegranate grove to rise up and to follow him into battle. What does it mean for you and I to find a vision of clarity that is so real to us that as church leaders we run into battle saying, perhaps God will move on our behalf today? What does it mean to live bravely in the direction of Jesus?